The applause started right after my father said, "Some kids are worth betting on, some aren't." I was standing outside the glass conference room, holding a box of backup routers like hired help, while my brother Evan smiled under the lights. Dad lifted his champagne glass and looked straight through me. "Evan is the only success story this family ever produced." People laughed softly, the kind of laugh rich people use when cruelty sounds expensive. Then the demo screen behind Evan flickered. A red error message flashed across the projection. One of the engineers whispered, "Backend authentication just failed." Evan's smile froze. Dad's eyes snapped toward me like the crash was already my fault. "Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates." I stepped forward because I knew that error. I had written the original failover logic years ago, before Dad called my prototype too risky, and told me no investor would ever waste money on me. "I can fix it," I said. Dad cut me off in front of everyone. "You've embarrassed this family enough, Flora." A security guard touched my elbow. Then a woman in a grey suit stepped between us and said, "Flora Bennett." She handed me a sealed file. "You need to come into the boardroom immediately." For a second, no one moved. Not Evan, not Dad, not the investors who had just watched a multimillion-dollar launch collapse in real time. I looked down at the file. My name was printed across the front in black ink. Flora Bennett. Not Evan. Mine. Behind the glass, the giant screen still showed my brother's company name above the broken platform. The same platform that looked too much like the system I had built alone in my bedroom after Dad refused to fund it. A woman near the bar whispered, "Isn't she the daughter?" Someone else answered, "I heard she never finished anything." I kept my eyes on the file because looking at Dad would have made my hands shake. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Do not make a scene." But the woman in grey opened the boardroom door and waited for me like Dad's permission no longer mattered. Inside, 2 investors were already standing. One of them looked at me and said, "We have questions about who actually built this company." I walked into the boardroom expecting blame. That was how these things usually worked in my family. If Evan succeeded, Dad celebrated him like he'd invented electricity. If something broke, everyone somehow looked at me. The woman in grey shut the door behind me, while the muffled noise of the launch event faded outside. At the far end of the table sat 2 investors, a legal advisor, and 3 open laptops displaying lines of back-end infrastructure logs. One investor motioned toward a chair. "Please sit, Flora." I sat carefully, still holding the sealed file against my chest. The older investor leaned forward first. "Can you explain the redundancy structure used in the platform's predictive scaling system?" I blinked. "That depends which layer failed." The room went quiet. He exchanged a glance with the others. Then he asked another question. "How does the authentication recovery reconnect after a regional server interruption?" I answered automatically. "Secondary node validation, unless the primary branch still references archived credentials." The legal advisor typed something immediately. Only then did I realize what was happening. These weren't random technical questions. They already knew. My throat tightened. "You think I built the infrastructure?" The younger investor answered carefully. "We think you understand it better than the current CEO." Current CEO. Not founder. Not creator. CEO. A very specific word. I looked down at the open laptop nearest me and saw a familiar naming structure buried in the system logs. FBN Core. My initials. I hadn't used that branch name in years. Dad had called the project a hobby back then, something I obsessed over while Evan networked with venture capital firms and attended startup conferences funded by my parents. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table trying to show Dad the prototype. He barely looked up from his phone. No investor is putting money behind something built by a girl who can't even pitch confidently. 3 months later, Evan announced his new AI platform. Same infrastructure logic. Same architecture pattern. Same scalability framework. At the time, I convinced myself it had to be coincidence because the alternative hurt too much. The older investor slid a printed report toward me. During due diligence, every critical engineering signature traced back to your archived development branch. I stared at the pages. Repository histories. Commit timestamps. Internal markers. All mine. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I looked up slowly. Are you investigating fraud? Nobody answered. Not immediately. The silence was worse. The younger investor finally folded his hands together. Flora, your brother may not legally control this company at all. When I walked back into the launch hall, the atmosphere had completely changed. An hour earlier, investors were drinking champagne under giant screens, showing Evan's projected valuation climbing past $30 million. Now clusters of people stood around whispering, while technicians crawled under tables reconnecting cables. The demo screen was black. Dad was near the stage, forcing a smile onto his face. Minor technical delay, he announced. We'll resume shortly. Then he saw me carrying the file. His expression hardened instantly. Evan noticed it too. For the first time that night, he looked nervous. Dad crossed the room toward me before I could say anything. What did they tell you? He demanded quietly. I think you already know. His jaw tightened. You are not going to ruin this launch because you're bitter. Several nearby guests turned toward us. A reporter lowered her phone slightly, listening. I should have backed down, normally I would have. Instead, I looked at Evan. What's the fallback sequence for the predictive load balancer after authentication collapse? He stared at me. What? The system architecture, I said evenly. What's the fallback sequence? Evan glanced toward Dad. Then back at me. I don't know what you're trying to do right now. One of the investors stepped closer. Mr. Bennett, you presented yourself as lead architect during negotiations. Evan swallowed hard. I oversee the company. That wasn't the question. The room got quieter. People were openly watching now. I asked another question. What branch handles regional failover recovery? Evan's face drained of color. He didn't answer because he couldn't. The younger investor finally spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The platform contains protected development markers tied to Flora Bennett's archived repository. Murmurs spread immediately. Someone whispered, "Wait, what?" Dad stepped in quickly. This is family confusion being exaggerated during a stressful launch. But before he could pull Evan away, the legal advisor walked onto the stage holding a folder. Her voice cut cleanly across the room. Ownership disputes regarding the company's core infrastructure were already under review prior to tonight's event. Every conversation stopped. Phones came out instantly. Investors near the bar started leaving their tables. Employees exchanged panicked looks. Evan looked at Dad like he wanted instructions. Dad looked at me like he wanted me erased. One investor approached the legal advisor. What happens to the funding round now? Temporarily frozen pending emergency verification. The words landed like a bomb. Dad grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and pulled me aside near the hallway. If you destroy this company, he hissed, you destroy this family. I finally looked him directly in the eyes. You already did that years ago. Before he could answer, the legal advisor stepped back onto the stage. All further presentations are suspended effective immediately. The boardroom doors locked behind us while the launch event unraveled outside. Through the glass walls, I could see reporters gathering near the lobby entrance. Employees stood in nervous circles checking their phones. Somewhere down the hall, someone was arguing loudly about payroll access. Inside the room, nobody was pretending this was a technical delay anymore. It was a collapse. The lead investor pushed a stack of documents across the table toward me. "We need you to review these." I looked down and immediately recognized old repository records. My repository records. Timestamp histories. Licensing agreements. Prototype branch transfers. One file still had the apartment address from the tiny studio, where I built the first version of the infrastructure after college. I looked up slowly. "How did you even get these?" "Your father provided partial records during incorporation," the legal advisor said. "The rest surfaced during technical review." My stomach turned. Richard had actually transferred my files into Evan's company. Not inspired by them. Not recreated. Transferred. The evidence was everywhere. Original commit histories linked directly to my developer credentials, archived documentation with my notes still embedded in the code comments. Even the scaling architecture carried namming structures I used years ago. Across the table, Evan looked pale. "You told me she abandoned it," he said quietly to Dad. Richard didn't answer. Evan stared harder. "You said you legally bought her concepts." Dad finally snapped. "She wasn't doing anything with them." I felt something in my chest tighten hearing that. Not because it surprised me. Because he sounded completely certain he'd been justified. The younger investor opened another file. "There's more." He rotated the screen toward me. A communication log appeared. Investor meeting requests. Technical review invitations. Engineering consultations. All redirected away from me over the last 2 years. Every single one filtered through Richard. "He intentionally prevented direct contact between you and investors," the advisor said. "We believe he was concerned you'd expose Evan's limited technical involvement." Outside the boardroom, a wave of voices suddenly rose louder. News was spreading fast. One employee rushed past the glass holding a phone to his ear. Another investor entered the room looking furious. "Journalists already know there's an ownership dispute." The lead investor nodded once. "We expected that." Then he turned back toward me. "The launch failure revealed active admin credentials under your name." I frowned. That access should have been archived years ago. It was. A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone understood what that meant. The entire platform still depended on infrastructure connected to me. Not Evan. Not Richard. Me. The legal advisor placed another set of documents onto the table. Emergency restructuring paperwork. Potential fraud exposure notices. Civil liability assessments. Richard finally looked uncertain for the first time in my life. Evan rubbed both hands over his face. "Dad told me you quit," he muttered. I looked at him across the table and realized something horrible. Dad hadn't just lied to investors. He'd lied differently to both of us. The boardroom door opened again. The lead investor walked in carrying a finalized folder. He placed it directly in front of me. Then he said, "We've made our decision about who this company belongs to." Nobody spoke after that. The lead investor sat down across from me and opened the folder slowly while every person in the room watched. Outside the glass walls, the launch event was finished. Employees were leaving in tense silence. Reporters crowded the lobby downstairs. Security had already stopped letting new people into the building. Inside the boardroom, $31 million was about to change hands. The investor folded his hands together. "We identified inconsistencies during due diligence 3 weeks ago." Dad immediately leaned forward. "This is unnecessary." "It became necessary," the investor interrupted, "when your son repeatedly failed technical reviews regarding his own platform." Evan looked down at the table. The investor continued. "At first we assumed he lacked communication skills. Then our engineers discovered nearly every meaningful system innovation traced back to infrastructure branches registered under Flora Bennett. He slid another document toward me. The launch failure confirmed it. I looked down at the pages. Active credential dependencies. Core architecture ownership logs. Infrastructure authority records. My name was everywhere. The investor looked directly at me. Large portions of the platform were never legally reassigned from your development structure. The company could not fully operate tonight without your authorization chain. Dad's voice sharpened. She was never supposed to retain that access. The room went still after he said it. Because now even he realized how bad that sounded. The legal advisor spoke next. The emergency meeting tonight was not about removing Flora from the company. She paused. It was about determining whether she was capable of leading it. The sealed file finally made sense. My hands felt cold as I opened it completely. Inside were amended ownership documents, emergency executive authority transfers, board restructuring agreements, and the finalized funding contract, $31 million, under my names. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was looking at. Dad stared at the paperwork like it physically offended him. Evan looked sick. The investor's voice softened slightly. Ms. Bennett, you are the only person we've interviewed who fully understands the platform your family attempted to raise funding for. Dad finally snapped. I was protecting the stronger investment. I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who spent years telling me I wasn't worth backing. The man who called my work unrealistic until it made someone else rich. You told people I was unstable, I said quietly. Nobody interrupted. You told investors I couldn't finish projects. You let people believe I failed because it was easier than admitting you never gave me a chance. Dad opened his mouth, but I kept going. You took my work, handed it to Evan, funded him with millions, then made me stand outside carrying equipment at the launch. Evan closed his eyes. Dad tried one last time. This family built everything you have. I signed the agreement before he finished the sentence. The sound of the pen hitting the table afterward seemed louder than the applause from earlier that night. The lead investor immediately extended his hand. Congratulations, Ms. Bennett. Just like that, the funding transferred officially into my control. Within 48 hours, Richard Bennett was removed from all advisory involvement. 2 weeks later, articles started circulating about the Bennett family scandal and disputed intellectual property claims. Investors publicly distanced themselves from Dad. Several partnerships disappeared almost overnight. Evan resigned before the end of the month. Not because I forced him to, because every executive meeting exposed how little of the company he actually understood. A surprising number of employees stayed. Mostly engineers. One of them told me privately, we figured out pretty quickly who really built this thing. I hired an independent leadership team within the first month and restored several developers Dad had pushed aside during Evan's takeover. The company relaunched 6 months later under a different name. No Bennett branding. No family board seats. No staged speeches. Just a functioning platform built by people who actually understood it. My new office overlooked the operations floor. Sometimes I'd catch myself watching the engineers work late and remember building the first version alone in my apartment, while Dad said nobody would ever invest in me. Richard called dozens of times after the scandal broke. I never answered. Evans sent one message. I should have asked more questions. That was the closest thing to an apology either of us ever got. Months later, during a relaunch interview, a reporter asked me what changed everything. I thought about the launch night, about standing outside the room while my father called my brother the only success story in the family. Then I answered. The moment they stopped deciding what I was worth,